If your car has been idling rough, stalling at red lights, hesitating when you press the gas, or throwing a lean code like the P0171 or the P0174 code, stop for a second before you replace anything. Because one of the smallest, cheapest components under your hood can trick you into replacing oxygen sensors, a mass airflow sensor, fuel injectors, or even an entire throttle body when none of those parts are actually bad. A simple vacuum leak can create symptoms that look serious, feel expensive, and lead you straight into the wrong repair. And the worst part is this: a vacuum leak doesn't always scream for attention. Sometimes it whispers. It shows up as a slight RPM fluctuation at idle, a faint hissing sound you barely notice. A fuel trim number is creeping upward on your scan tool. It creates just enough imbalance to confuse you, your scan tool, and sometimes even a mechanic who isn't looking carefully. So let's break this down properly. First, you need to understand what an engine vacuum really is. Inside a gasoline engine, when the throttle plate is partially closed, especially at idle, the pistons are pulling air in faster than the throttle is allowing it to enter. That creates low pressure inside the intake manifold, which we call vacuum. That vacuum isn't just a side effect. It's used to operate systems. It assists your brake booster. It feeds the PCV system. It helps control certain actuators. On older vehicles, it even controlled emissions devices and transmission modulators. A vacuum leak happens when unmetered air sneaks into the engine after the mass airflow sensor. That air hasn't been measured. The engine control unit calculates fuel based on the air it thinks is entering the engine. When extra air enters through a cracked hose, worn gasket, or leaking manifold, the ECU doesn't see it, so it injects less fuel than needed. Now your air-fuel mixture becomes lean. The ideal air-fuel ratio for most gasoline engines is around 14.7 parts air to 1 part fuel. When extra air enters through a leak, that ratio shifts lean, meaning there's too much air and not enough fuel. Lean mixtures burn hotter. They can cause rough running, misfires, hesitation, and, over time, damage. One of the earliest signs of a vacuum leak is a slightly unstable idle. You might notice the RPM rising and falling gently when the car is stopped. What's happening is the ECU is trying to correct the imbalance. It sees a lean condition from the oxygen sensors and adds fuel. Then it pulls back. Then it adds again. The engine is constantly chasing a stable mixture, and you feel that instability. Another common symptom is higher than normal idle speed. If enough extra air is entering the engine, it can raise idle RPM because the engine is effectively getting more airflow than intended. You start the car, and instead of sitting calmly at 700 or 800 RPM, it's hovering around 1,200 or more. That's not always a throttle body problem. It can simply be a leak. Fuel trims are where things get interesting. If you plug in a scan tool and look at short-term fuel trim and long-term fuel trim, you'll see how hard your engine is working to compensate. Normally, fuel trims hover around plus or minus 5%. When you see long-term fuel trim climbing to plus 15% or higher, especially at idle, that's often a strong indicator of a vacuum leak. The engine is adding fuel because it sees a lean condition. If both banks on a V engine are showing lean codes, that's even more telling. A leak that affects both sides of the engine, such as an intake manifold gasket or a large hose, can cause P0171 and P0174 codes at the same time. That's when people often start replacing oxygen sensors, thinking the sensors are lying. In reality, the sensors are reporting accurately. The engine is lean because of unmetered air. You might also experience hesitation during acceleration. When you press the gas, the engine may feel delayed, almost like it's thinking about responding before it finally moves. That hesitation happens because the air-fuel ratio is off, and combustion isn't as strong as it should be. Sometimes you'll even get backfires or popping through the intake if the mixture becomes too lean to ignite consistently. Misfires are another possibility. A lean mixture can cause incomplete combustion, and that can trigger random misfire codes like P0300 or cylinder-specific misfires. If you only have one cylinder misfiring, it could be a localized intake gasket leak near that cylinder. If multiple cylinders are misfiring and fuel trims are high, that points more toward a broader intake leak. A hard brake pedal is a symptom that many drivers overlook. Your brake booster relies on engine vacuum. If the vacuum supply line to the booster is cracked or disconnected, your brake pedal can feel stiff and require more effort. That's not just a drivability issue, that's a safety issue. Now here's where vacuum leaks get misdiagnosed most often. They mimic other problems perfectly. A vacuum leak can look like a bad mass airflow sensor because both cause lean codes. It can look like a bad oxygen sensor because the O2 sensor is reporting lean. It can even look like a weak fuel pump because the engine feels underpowered. But here's the key difference. A bad MAF sensor usually affects the engine across all RPM ranges. A vacuum leak is most noticeable at idle and low RPM because vacuum is highest there. As you press the gas and the throttle opens wider, vacuum drops and the effect of the leak becomes less significant. So if your car runs rough at idle but smooths out at higher RPM, that's a strong clue. Turbocharged engines add another layer. In turbo systems, you may hear people talk about boost leaks. While boost leaks and vacuum leaks aren't identical, they're related. A leak in the intake plumbing before the throttle body can cause underboost conditions and hesitation under load. On turbo engines, you might see codes related to boost pressure rather than just lean codes. Diesel engines are a little different because they don't rely on throttle-controlled vacuum the same way gasoline engines do. However, they still use vacuum pumps for brake boosters and actuators. A leak in those systems can still cause brake or control issues even if it doesn't cause a lean fuel mixture. So how do you diagnose this without guessing? Start simple. With the engine off, open the hood and visually inspect every vacuum hose you can see. Look for cracked rubber, brittle plastic lines, loose fittings, disconnected hoses. Pay close attention to the PCV hose, brake booster line, evac lines, and the intake tube between the air filter box and throttle body. That intake tube often develops cracks on the underside where you can't see them easily.
Next, start the engine and listen. A vacuum leak often produces a high-pitched hissing or whistling sound. Move slowly around the engine bay. If you hear a consistent hiss, try to trace it. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's subtle.
If you have a scan tool, check fuel trims at idle and then at 2,500 RPM. If fuel trims are high at idle but improve significantly when you raise RPM, that points strongly toward a vacuum leak. There are also spray tests. With the engine idling, you can carefully spray carb cleaner or intake cleaner around suspected leak areas. If the RPM suddenly changes, you may have found a leak. But be cautious. Carb cleaner is flammable. Keep a fire extinguisher nearby and avoid spraying near hot exhaust components. Some people use propane in a similar way, directing unlit propane around suspected leaks. If the engine smooths out, that indicates a leak. Again, caution is critical. These methods work because the added fuel compensates for the lean mixture temporarily. A safer method for many is the water spray test. Lightly spraying water around suspected leak areas can temporarily seal small leaks. If the idle changes, that suggests you've located the problem. The small amount of water used in this test will not harm the engine when done properly. Professional shops often use a smoke machine. The intake system is sealed and filled with low-pressure smoke. Wherever smoke escapes, that's your leak. It's one of the most effective methods and often worth the diagnostic fee if you can't locate the leak yourself. And if you don't have access to a professional smoke machine, you can simulate one using a cigar or even a high-output incense stick. Blow the smoke into a disconnected vacuum line with the engine off. Any wisp of smoke escaping the intake tract reveals your leak point. Now let's talk about fixing it. If you find a cracked hose, replace it. Don't try to permanently patch it with glue. Temporary fixes may get you home, but heat and pressure under the hood will eventually break that patch down. Vacuum hoses are inexpensive. Replace them properly. If the intake manifold gasket is leaking, that repair is more involved. The manifold has to be removed, gasket surfaces cleaned, and new gaskets installed with proper torque sequence. This is where you need to honestly assess your skill level. Improper installation can create new leaks. Brake booster leaks usually require booster replacement. If your brake pedal is hard and you hear hissing near the firewall, that's not something to ignore. That's safety related. After repairs, clear the codes and monitor fuel trims again. They should return closer to zero. If long-term fuel trim remains high, you may have missed a leak, or there may be another issue. Can you drive with a vacuum leak? Technically, yes, in many cases, but it's not recommended. Running lean increases combustion temperatures. Over time, that can damage valves, pistons, and catalytic converters. It can also cause poor performance and increased emissions. How much does it cost to fix? A simple hose replacement might cost less than $50. An intake gasket repair could range from a couple of hundred to several hundred depending on the vehicle. A smoke test at a shop may cost around $100 to $200, but it can save you from replacing parts unnecessarily. Here's the biggest mistake drivers make. They see a lean code and immediately replace the oxygen sensor. The oxygen sensor reports the condition. It doesn't cause it. If the engine is lean because of extra air, the sensor is just doing its job. Replacing it won't fix the underlying problem. Another mistake is cleaning the throttle body or replacing the mass airflow sensor without verifying fuel trims and checking for leaks first. Always rule out unmetered air before replacing expensive components. If your engine idles roughly, fuel trims are high at idle, and the problem improves when revving the engine, start with vacuum leaks. If your brake pedal is stiff and you hear hissing, inspect the booster line. If both banks show lean codes, think intake manifold or a major hose. A vacuum leak may seem small, but it can create a chain reaction of symptoms that mislead you. The key is understanding how the system works, recognizing the patterns, and following a logical diagnostic path instead of guessing. Once you approach it that way, what once looked like a complicated engine issue often turns out to be a simple cracked hose or worn gasket, and instead of replacing sensors, you solve the root problem. That's the difference between throwing parts at a car and actually diagnosing it. One thing most people never think about is how small vacuum leaks slowly escalate. In the beginning, it might just be a slightly rough idle. Then the fuel trims creep up. Then the check engine light comes on. Then you start noticing hesitation when merging onto the highway. Then maybe the engine misfires under load. If you ignore it long enough, that constant lean condition raises combustion temperatures. Higher temperatures stress valves, spark plugs, and catalytic converters. What started as a $5 hose can slowly turn into a much more expensive repair. Cold starts are another clue that people overlook. If your car starts rough in the morning but smooths out as it warms up, that can be a vacuum leak. When the engine is cold, it needs a richer mixture. If extra air is sneaking in, the mixture becomes even leaner than expected, and the engine struggles until it reaches operating temperature. Once warm, fuel control becomes more stable and the symptoms may partially disappear. That temporary improvement often tricks people into ignoring the real cause. Air conditioning can also expose a vacuum leak. When you turn the AC on, engine load increases. If the idle control system is already struggling to maintain balance because of a leak, turning on the AC may cause the RPM to dip sharply or even stall. That's not always an idle air control valve issue. Sometimes it's unmetered air creating instability under load changes. If you drive an older vehicle that uses a vacuum modulator for the transmission, a vacuum leak can even affect shifting. Harsh shifts or delayed shifts can sometimes be traced back to vacuum supply problems. In modern electronically controlled transmissions, the effect is more indirect, but incorrect engine load calculations from a lean condition can still influence shift behavior. It's also important to understand that not every lean condition is a vacuum leak. A weak fuel pump, clogged fuel filter, or dirty injectors can also create lean codes. That's why checking fuel trims at different RPM ranges is so important. If trims are high at idle but normalize under throttle, that points toward a vacuum leak. If trims stay high across all RPM ranges, you may be dealing with a fuel delivery problem instead. Here's the simplest decision framework you can follow. If your car runs rough at idle but smooth at higher RPM, suspect a vacuum leak. If fuel trims are high at idle but improve when revving the engine, suspect a vacuum leak. If you hear a hissing sound that changes with RPM, suspect a vacuum leak. If both banks show lean codes and you haven't confirmed fuel pressure issues, suspect a vacuum leak. If the brake pedal is stiff and you hear air leaking near the firewall, inspect the brake booster and vacuum line immediately. And if you've already replaced sensors and the lean condition persists, go back and check for unmetered air before replacing anything else. Vacuum leaks are frustrating because they're often invisible, but they follow patterns. Once you understand those patterns, diagnosing them becomes much more logical and much less intimidating. The goal isn't just to fix the problem. The goal is to avoid replacing parts that were never bad. Once you train yourself to think in terms of airflow balance and fuel correction instead of guessing based on codes alone, you start diagnosing instead of gambling. A vacuum leak is rarely the most expensive repair on a vehicle, but misdiagnosing it can be. Now, if you want to take this even further and learn how to tell the difference between a vacuum leak and a bad mass airflow sensor, because those two get confused more than anything else, then the next video here breaks that down step by step and shows you exactly how to separate the two before you spend $1. If this guide helped you, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next diagnostic breakdown. Also, like and share this video with someone who's dealing with any of the issues we talked about. It helps support the channel.